Cuba, a fisherman looks for dinner, 30 feet below. He can hold his breath for 3 minutes, a useful skill in a country where food is often hard to come by. He's got tonight's dinner, but someone else is hunting here, and he's after more than fish. This is Glen Costello, who's in Cuban waters by invitation of Fidel Castro. He's hunting for Spanish galleons that sank 3 centuries ago, carrying billions in gold, jewels, and other loot from the New World. Cuba is the only part of the Caribbean that's never been searched by treasure hunters. Until now.
This is Spanish treasure. It came off a galleon that sank called the Nuestra Señora de las Mercedes. These coins are 300 years old, and we're the first people to find them after that length of time and bring them up off the sea bottom. And there's plenty more where this came from.
Costello and his crew have been given first right to look for Cuba's treasure, in a venture that mixes swashbuckling Canadian capitalists, Cuban communists, and sunken Spanish galleons. It's one of the oldest fantasies of our time.
I've been a construction diver most of my life, and that's the most unromantic occupation I can think of. We work in the water, you can't see your hand in front of your face. And Glenn came to me and said, "How would you like to dive for treasure in Cuba?" And I said, "Well, sure, I'd love to." I said, that's every diver's dream since he was a kid.
My initial reaction was to laugh. I even wondered if other people would think that we were crazy. At this juncture in our lives, we should be cozying ourselves up for retirement instead of going out looking for treasure in Cuba.
Their Cuban partner, Eddie, is a socialist with a cell phone. He hates treasure hunters so much they can't even say the word treasure around him.
No nos gusta. A nosotros nos molesta esa terminología. Nos molesta porque los cazadores de tesoros deterioran, destruyen el patrimonio. Nosotros tratamos de preservar el patrimonio.
A major galleon recovery results in a revenue stream of hundreds of millions of dollars.
It's lucky Eddie isn't in Canada to meet Cuba's other partners. They're definitely using that treasure word.
Some friends approached and said, "How would you like to do something really off the wall?" And not only was it a treasure hunt, but it was a treasure hunt in Cuba, and Fidel Castro was going to be our partner. And I said no. I said, definitely not even for me, and I'll do just about anything.
Their enemies will do just about anything too, to stop them. They're Cuban exiles in Miami.
If there is gold out there, it doesn't belong to Fidel Castro to do business with it. It's like the new pirates are now going to be coming from Canada to ransack the island. Is that what this is all about?
Fidel Castro once said that no one would take Cuba's treasure because it was the heritage of the Cuban people. So he never allowed anyone to hunt for the many Spanish galleons that sank off Cuba's shore. But now Castro's attitude has changed, and he's giving a foreigner first crack at the booty. And the reason why says a lot about Cuba today. Cuba in the 90s is a land of contradictions, where poverty and hardship share the streets with passion and dreams. The slogans of the revolution still live on every street corner of Havana, calling for socialism and sacrifice. But for many, the revolution has lost its momentum. The U.S. trade embargo on Cuba has left this battered country in a time warp. Even rooftop statues must be strapped on so the angels don't fall on passers-by. Havana is a melancholic place where everything seems to need repair. You drive whatever you can get your hands on in this town. The revolution still boasts many accomplishments, including some of the best literacy and healthcare levels in the Third World, and a place where blacks and whites mix easily. But dissatisfaction is rising, and so is opportunity. Since the Soviet Union's collapse, Cuba has lost billions in badly needed aid. Basic goods have become scarce: gas, drugs, even glasses. Some small riots in Havana 4 years ago were the worst signs of discontent since the revolution. Fidel Castro has tried to keep up the revolutionary zeal with some vintage 7-hour speeches and political theater. At the internment of Che Guevara, he told workers to resist the U.S. or die. But the enemy is already inside the capital's gates, with a growing desire for more consumer goods and freedom. And even Castro cannot turn back the tide. To ease the crisis, Castro has opened up the state economy and allowed some private markets, restaurants, and even stores that sell Western goods, as long as you have Western currency.
Dólares. Cubano no, dólares.
U.S. greenbacks have become legal currency that's left the Cuban peso worthless. Dollars are now the truly revolutionary force in Cuba. But the most symbolic sign of the new times is Castro welcoming those old buccaneers, the treasure hunters. He knows the lost Spanish booty could fill Cuba's treasury if someone could just find it. Enter our man in Havana, Glen Costello, who's among the world's elite of deep-sea divers. Costello heard through the grapevine that Castro was open to a deal with treasure hunters, and he decided to dive in.
Cuba's an adventure. I think people need some excitement in their life. And in my case, that seemed exciting. It seemed like an exciting thing to do, and it was possible to do it. So I went for it.
Costello is no stranger to excitement. He lives in Canada, but he's welded underwater pipeline in the Middle East and salvaged cruise ships in Venice. He once brought up bodies from a plane crash deep below the Arctic Ocean. And his wife Charlie says that danger seems to make him happy.
He just has this penchant for living on the edge, whether he's driving his car at high speed, he had a motorcycle and he'd drive it like a wild man, or he's not happy unless he's living on the edge.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know, I think he's crazy. I'm not supposed to say that, am I?
The biggest danger Costello faces here is bureaucracy. This is his Cuban government partner, Eddie Fernandez, a former army captain. He's Costello's 6th boss since Castro first agreed to a treasure hunt.
At the beginning, when I first came down to Cuba, if I'd have known that it would take as long as it did, I'd have given up. But at the time, I thought it would be a matter of 6 months tops to put a contract together, and we'd be working down here, but it didn't work out that way.
In fact, it took 2.5 years just to negotiate a deal, and they're still negotiating over everything from who pays for paper clips to Cuba's numbingly bureaucratic approach to history and heritage.
It's an approach, an historical approach to both fleets.
Cuba gets over half the treasure, but party politics still drives things more than profit.
Fuimos socialistas, somos socialistas y seguiremos siendo socialistas. Con inversión extranjera, sin inversión extranjera, porque nuestro socialismo es indestructible. El team tiene una copia de este documento.
There is another copy from this document.
I used to wait sometimes for an hour for them to show up for a meeting. And sometimes I'd show up for a meeting, they wouldn't show up at all. And they'd say, well, you know, we changed it to tomorrow, but we couldn't get you on the telephone. So we overcome that problem by supplying them with a cellular telephone, so I can get a hold of them. And then they can't use the telephone system as an excuse.
Eddie's gotten used to his cell phone, and you can't blame him. A phone that actually works comes in handy in a country where little else does. Socialism may be indestructible, but it's also intractable. Every time Glen's boat leaves or returns to harbor, it's searched by soldiers trained to ferret out the latest tricks of Yankee imperialism, even when it's just Canadians. Fortunately, the cell phone socialist is there to work his magic. Glen's gotten used to the daily routine, but his boat captain, Ted Hill, is baffled by the bureaucracy.
There's always one more paper. For a country where you can't get toilet paper, it just amazes me how much paperwork goes on in this country. Eventually we'll get out. We'll get one more paper and we'll be done.
What do they want?
One more paper. It's always one more.
Eventually, Eddie does work out the paperwork, and at last, Glen and his crew are ready to head out into the open sea. Glen's crew is a mix of Canadians and Cubans. The Cuban crew includes Freddie Navarro and Ruben Espinoza, who's one of Cuba's top divers. And of course, there's Eddie, a landlubber who tends to get seasick. This old boat is equipped with a satellite location system and all the latest gear. This is a magnetometer, a huge metal detector that's dragged over the ocean bottom. But it won't detect gold, gems, or other treasure, just metal from ships wrecked at sea.
They'll pick up the items associated with the treasure, the anchors, the cannons, only the ferrous metal. And we just log the data all day. And later on, we might dive here, 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 here.
I'm going to hold the anchors.
We start out bajo.
Exacto.
The crew speaks to each other in what they call Spanglish. This is the first time Ruben has worked with foreigners.
Estoy acostumbrado a trabajar con buzos aquí en Cuba que no trabajan tanto. Simplemente paran un poco, frenan un poco. Pero con Ted me gustó y me impresionó mucho el ánimo de trabajo. Siempre en el agua, siempre trabajando y siempre con deseos de trabajar.
Many of the ships that wrecked on these reefs were salvaged by the Spanish some 3 centuries ago. But they used primitive equipment, and Cubans who could hold their breath just like modern spear fishermen. Today's treasure hunters use metal detectors and tanks of air. Scuba gear wasn't widely available to divers until the 1960s, but by then Castro was in power. So while the rest of the Caribbean was combed by treasure hunters, Cuba has remained off limits. The crew still remembers when Ted found his first Spanish coins.
We go down so many times and come up with pop cans or, whatever, garbage. And then to actually go down and find a 300-year-old coin.
He didn't use the ladder when he came back on the boat. He just flew straight up out of the water with 4 coins in his hand.
Yeah, that's exciting. Silver coin.
I don't believe it. I found silver coin.
The coins we found there were dated 1698. So that coin sat there for 300 years. And in that 300 years, the United States became a country and people have gone to the moon. And all that time that coin just sat there. And then we come along and now we have that coin. I just find that fascinating. When you find one coin, the anticipation that there's something else. One coin didn't arrive there by itself. There was other things there, and okay, now we're looking for the gold. And
sometimes I have to say, come on, Ted, it's dark. Let's go home. I'm starving.
Every shipwreck's like a time capsule. Then you open it up and you find out how the people lived in that time. And that's exciting to find stuff like that. Then we found a sword. And the sword was a real rush because it was almost intact. As you can see, it's a beauty. It's covered in coral. And we had to keep it immersed in water to prevent deterioration. And the only place we could find to store it was in this bathtub. It's a pain because every time I want to take a shower, I have to take the sword out, drain the water, have my shower, and then put the sword back in the bathtub again.
Most of the treasure they found is stored in Cuba's Archaeology Museum, which looks as beat up as the rest of the country. Inside a storage room, one of Cuba's top marine archaeologists, Carlos Alberto Oliva, examines the loot. There are pieces of silver, opals, and other artifacts found on a ship called the Mercedes. It had been partly salvaged by the Spaniards 3 centuries earlier, but these leftovers are still worth over $500,000, and Carlos Alberto is sure there's lots more where it comes from.
No por gusto a La Habana le decían, o le llave el Nuevo Mundo. O sea, todo el sistema de navegación español tenía como su centro principal La Habana. Los valores, todo lo que se extraía del Nuevo Mundo, básicamente pasaba por La Habana y se produjeron infinidad de naufragios en nuestras costas.
The boats may be down there, but figuring out where they sank is the hard part in a sea of possibilities. For that, Glen must go back to the origins of the boat's voyages, 300 years and an ocean away in Spain. This is where many treasure ships started out, but it's no longer a great port town. Today, only tour boats pass the old customs houses where Spanish ships returned to count their gold. The Spanish also kept records of boats that didn't return, and Glen has someone sifting through them at Seville's Archive of the Indies, Spain's museum of ancient maps and documents. Victoria Johnson is Glen's Seville treasure sleuth. She says the Spanish were as bureaucratic as today's Cubans. They held royal inquiries into every shipwreck and recorded every piece of missing cargo from cocoa to gold.
We found one boat that we're working on right now called the
the Trinidad. This ship was full of gold, silver, jewels, all sorts of things.
To find the ship's last known location, Victoria studies the testimonies of survivors. It takes detective work, because navigation was hardly an exact science back then.
It was very difficult to say exactly where you were. There was nothing like latitude and longitude. So if ship sinks, you say 4 leagues from the port of Havana, or a cannon shot from the beach, which for people at that time was the clearest they could get, clearest they could be about explaining where the ship sank. Now for us today, it's quite difficult to go and look for a ship that's a cannon shot away from the beach, no?
Back in Havana, Glen and the Cubans pore over the 200 boats Victoria has found and try to pinpoint their location. Unlike most treasure hunters, they document every wreck for historical reasons, though most have no record of treasure.
It doesn't matter that each one of the ships isn't perhaps filled with lots of treasure. It's very methodical. It's being done very carefully, very seriously. It's not at all typical. It's not at all typical. I think it's very Canadian. Very thorough and very perfectionist.
Does that mean you're more likely to find gold or less?
I don't know. That I can't say. There's an element of, in this sort of work, there's always an element of luck.
Luck and money. It costs about $50,000 a month to stay afloat. And so Glen heads back home to Vancouver, Canada, looking for every treasure hunter's best friend, investors.
11 in Vancouver.
Hello, operator.
I gotta buy.
Trading.
The Vancouver Stock Exchange is Canada's riskiest stock market. Traders sell all kinds of get-rich-quick schemes here, from diamond mines in the Arctic to the next Bre-X.
I don't know, whatever you want. Go 4 3/8, 2x2. 1,500.
Costello's company goes under the name Terra West and sells for about 20 cents a share.
Terra West. TAW.A. Hey, you see it? Treasure hunting in Cuba. Blackbeard's treasure? 5,000 on the bid. That's me on the offer. What do you want to do? Beautiful. Okay, bye.
Gentlemen, the project that we're embarking upon is a joint venture with the Cuban government. Thank you very much for coming along today.
Glen's associate Ian Rigg makes an unusual pitch to would-be investors.
In Cuba. There's the man who made it all possible. He took power just about the time that the technology was becoming available for scuba divers to get access to the wrecks that we're presently looking at.
This is where money comes from in modern-day treasure hunts. The cash Castro and Costello always need to finance their venture. This isn't part of the job Costello enjoys.
How much have you recovered? What's it worth, and where is it being held?
Well, in the low end, it's worth about $500,000. What we recovered so far, but that's a conservative estimate. It could be higher. Any other questions?
But his investors also seem attracted by more than money.
You know, it's a bit of a fairy tale, I guess, a bit of a totally blue sky thing. I mean, it's not like looking at an industrial deal that you can, look at the financials or the math, or you can look at a business plan. It's, some sort of, latent adventure or vicarious adventure or something.
There's lots of ways you can invest your money. You can go down the street now and get a 5% return. All depends on what you want out of it.
Are you interested?
Sure. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't interested.
It's the adventure. It is a gold fever. It's a gold rush.
Maybe it's a rush in Canada, but not in the States, just 200 kilometers north of Cuba. This is Miami's Little Havana, home of the Cuban exiles.
Hello, Miami, and hello, Cuba. This is our first Christmas broadcast, not only for Miami, but for Cuba also. We'll be speaking in Spanish, en español en breve. Sigan en sintonía con nosotros.
700,000 Cubans live in Greater Miami, and they're the big losers of the revolution. Many fled Cuba on rafts, leaving behind their homes and families. Now word is leaking out about Canada's treasure hunters, and they're angry.
That money directly goes back to support Fidel, doesn't it? So why would you want to support that? Why would you help someone that's repressing their people, someone who at best is evil? You know, why would you want to do that?
These aren't just empty words. In Miami, they remember those who fought Castro and encourage them to fight again.
Revolution is for any country the most violent means of change, bringing death, destruction, and hatred.
Ever since the revolution, Cuban exiles have led the American propaganda war against Cuba.
Little did the Cuban people suspect that Castro would deliver them into the hands of the most ruthless of all tyrannies, the iron grip of communism.
The exiles have urged the states to keep the embargo and punish anyone doing business with Castro. Now, some want to go after Castro's treasure hunters. Cuban-American lawyer Nick Gutierrez warns that if Costello finds treasure, he better not try selling it to the big gold buyers in the States.
Sell it in Canada, sell it in Europe, sell it in Asia. But if you try to sell it in the U.S. marketplace, then they would be subject to U.S. laws and they could wind up losing that treasure. I would say to them, if they want to sell it elsewhere. Don't sell it in the United States.
For others, anywhere Costello sells his gold is too close for them. Nanosca Perez is the queen of Latin radio in Miami, but she's ready to take to the trenches if Costello finds treasure.
I'd be standing right out there with a sign in my hand saying that this is all going to benefit the dictator who is oppressing the Cuban people. I'm going to be out there saying that this would be like buying a souvenir probably from the Nazis or whoever uses it to oppress the people. That's what this would eventually be. Funds that benefit a dictatorship.
Well, there's two sides to every story. You know, there's the American side of the story and there's the Cuban side of the story. Now, I think that I spent a lot more time in Cuba than most of the Americans in Miami. And I see the Cuban side, and I need dollars desperately in order to survive.
Glen's latest search has brought him to Pinar del Rio province, some 8 hours and a world away from Havana. This is a poor region, hurt badly by the end of Russian aid. Few tourist dollars make it out here, and they're nostalgic for the good old days of the Soviet Union. They may have torn down the statues of Lenin in Moscow, but he's a popular guy here. In this area, gas is scarce, and locals must pick up hitchhikers by law. Glen and the crew do their part. Glen says the suffering is shared by most Cubans, even officials who work with him.
I met people that came to our meetings on bicycles. You know, they had to pedal 2 and 3 hours to arrive at the meeting spot, and then do the same thing going home at night. And the meetings would maybe break up at 11 o'clock at night, and they wouldn't get home till 2 in the morning, and then to be up the next morning at 4 o'clock to go to the next meeting on their bicycle. You know, conditions have improved a bit since then, but there's still, you know, a lot of hardship for a lot of these people.
This area may be poor, but it's thought to be the richest in Cuba for sunken galleons. The crew are the first foreigners out this way, and the locals can't figure out why they're here.
When we drive down the street in this town, every eye watches our van as we drive in. A lot of the fishermen, I think we're crazy. And they think they know everything that's here. But all they see is what's on top. They don't realize what's underneath. This area is probably the richest in the world for shipwrecks and for shipwrecks carrying precious cargo.
just begun to explore a new area where many shipwrecks took place on the reefs. On his first dive, Glen finds an old Spanish wreck, but no sign of treasure. Many of these boats were fleeing pirates who once roamed this area, and as the boats fled, they increased their speed by throwing things overboard. First the anchors, then the cannons, and finally their cargo. Sometimes the gold went down miles from where the boats were sunk. The big question is, where? Eventually, they spot a ship's cannon. But no one knows where the cargo is apart from the local wildlife. And this moray eel isn't telling. It's time to discuss their next move.
Cannons, 4 of them. It's a shipwreck site, pretty obvious. Need some more investigation, though.
Back it down a bit, Vic.
Now comes the hard part of treasure hunting. To see if there's any treasure hidden under the ocean sand, they use a technique called prop washing.
Okay, the other way, Brady. A little more. Whoa. Yeah, good, Brady.
They attach a big tube to the boat's propeller, and it's as dangerous as it is spectacular. They've got to watch out for the whirling blades and keep an eye open for passers-by, like this jellyfish. They blast the stream of water at the ocean floor, then head down into the vortex to see what's underneath the sand. It can take hours and sometimes days. Six hours later, they found nothing but disappointment.
In this wreck so far, we haven't found any coins. So we think, as of this point, this is not looking like a good wreck.
It's time to call it a day and catch up on loved ones in Havana.
Yeah, Glen wants to speak to her, so I'll say goodbye, I love you, and I'll see you tomorrow night.
Okay, I love you too, and I hope you do that. Over.
Goodbye.
Hi, sweetheart. It looks like I'll be able to get into Havana probably later on tomorrow afternoon.
Okay, over.
Really love you, darling.
Love you too.
Okay, see you tomorrow.
It's been a long, frustrating day, but you wouldn't know it. Everyone here knows that finding treasure can take years. In fact, the biggest treasure of modern times was discovered only 150 kilometers away from here, in Key West, Florida. And the man who found it became a Hollywood hero. Mel Fisher spent 17 years looking for a Spanish galleon called the Atocha before he found his pot of gold. Almost $500 million in gold bars, emeralds, and jewels. Today, Fisher inspires every treasure hunter waiting for their big day.
Well, that's what I told my divers every morning for 17 years. Today's the day. And sure enough, one day it was. and we found that huge pile of 80 tons of gold and silver, chests full of money and stuff. You ask any woman if they like emeralds, and they all say, I love emeralds. I'll do anything for an emerald, so we keep buying them emeralds. This stone right here is over $1 million, and I haven't kept count of them. We find hundreds and hundreds of them. There's a big market for all this stuff.
We're talking big bucks. Big bucks. Now it's tip and donation time for your rings.
Out on the pier of Florida's Key West, small-time hustlers hawk everything from conch chowder to performing parrots.
Pacho, say bang real loud.
But just across the way, Mel Fisher's treasure shop attracts more serious customers. And they're all eager to be seen with the man who's the master of marketing Spanish gold.
Yeah.
Very good. One more?
Yeah.
Okay.
Make sure they work.
Little expedition as well.
Fisher describes himself as the king of treasure, and he plays the part. At this Las Vegas auction, he sold off the Atosha's most valuable artifacts. It included everything from antique rings, bracelets, and necklaces to what looks like, well, a very expensive soup bowl. Fisher uses every last trick to market treasure, from selling it on the shopping channel to breaking it into pieces for those who just want trinkets.
The most popular thing that people buy are coins, definitely. Silver coins, gold coins, pieces of 8 and gold doubloons. The gold coins start about $3,000 and they go up to about $100,000. You do get a free t-shirt with the $100,000 coins.
Believe it or not, Glenn hopes to model himself after Fisher, if he ever finds gold.
I admire Fisher's marketing techniques. You know, I've seen some of his road shows that he puts on, and he does quite a good job of it. And it is a good way to market what you do find, you know, the less valuable pieces. He supplies a certificate with each piece, you know, saying that it came off the Atosha, and it's a piece of memorabilia for people to own. So I think it's a smart marketing move.
It's smart in some countries, but this is Cuba, where the biggest sign around warns that imperialists and capitalists are the enemy. And again, Costello has to navigate through tricky waters. Archaeologist Carlos Alberto is the government watchdog over the treasure hunt, the man in charge of protecting Cuba's heritage.
The estimated value of the cargo is, say, 500,000 pesos. That's 500,000 pesos of that era. In today's dollars, that would translate to considerably more than.
A cientos de dólares. Cientos de millones de dólares en la actualidad. En cualquier caso, estamos hablando
Carlos Alberto knows the exact value of every Spanish cargo.
Hundreds of millions of dollars.
We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, in effect, yeah.
But Carlos doesn't want to see any of it sold in Fisher-style roadshows, even if Fidel himself wants the money.
Es como ponerle precio a las pirámides de Egipto o como intentar comercializar la historia. Se hace. Hombre, un cuadro de Picasso se comercializa, las obras de arte se comercializan. Lo que yo pienso es que no se debe perder nunca la perspectiva histórica.
Well, in the beginning, Carlos Alberto wouldn't have anything to do with me. One of the first things Carlos said to me was that, you know, your idea of treasure and mine are two different things. You know, he says, treasure to me is a shipwreck site, and it doesn't even have to have one coin on it. He said, that's treasure to me.
Many marine scientists see treasure hunters as intruders, a reckless species that is the scourge of undersea life. Glen and his crew hope to change that image by leaving things just as they find them. The Atosha's treasures were retrieved by sucking them up with vacuum tubes, and some treasure hunters have blown up coral reefs with dynamite. Glen and his crew are very careful not to damage any coral, and they never use dynamite. His divers also record every artifact they find, even if they have no financial value, so Cuban archaeologists can retrieve them in the future. At first, Carlos Alberto saw his job as a pact with the devil. Now he's committed to Glen's team, but there's still no doubt where he'd put the treasure.
En un museo, claramente. No se irían de aquí, evidentemente. En un museo, claro. En un museo de arqueología submarina que en Cuba no hay. Increíble y paradójicamente no hay.
And I understand his thinking, and I respect it. But, you know, there's also a monetary side to this whole thing that I also have to respect the investors' wishes too. You know, I can't do everything that the archaeologists want, otherwise there would be no sense in anybody investing in this project at all.
Glen needs investors to keep the hunt going till he strikes gold. But it's tricky when the world's richest gold hunters, the Americans, aren't allowed to invest in Cuba. Or are they? The U.S. doesn't want Americans to visit Cuba, but Havana's marina is full of fishermen from Florida using a loophole to do some marlin fishing.
It was really easy for us on a private vessel. It's a rubber stamp application from the Coast Guard. You can't bring anything back, of course, and you can't spend any money while you're down.
You can't spend money?
But other than that, there's no rules.
So if you can't spend money, why do the Cubans let you in?
Well, they want us to come down here and spend the money we can't spend.
And we're not spending.
And we're not spending.
We're not spending.
And you're not spending?
Right.
Well, there's probably some spending of money by other boats. There's not on this one.
Some U.S. investors are also getting around their own embargo by investing in Canadian companies. This is Leo, an investor who attended the Vancouver pitch. He says he represents a U.S. software magnate who's looking for adventure. And he's just about ready to put big bucks behind Glen.
It's a risk-reward, and the risk is high, so the reward has to be high. But then again, the individual that I represent, he can afford it. So it's exciting for him, and it's exciting for myself. So it's something we want to get involved in.
Leo says he may buy Glen a second boat to double his chances. That's good news for Glen, though Cuba's waters are not as calm as they seem. Night in Havana looks oddly reminiscent of the days before the revolution. Here, too, Cuba is adapting to modern tourism, mixing socialism with the sex and sand of other Caribbean hotspots. All under the watchful eye of Che. Meanwhile, ordinary Cubans wait patiently for their lives to improve, as Castro caters to foreigners to keep his revolution alive. For Cuba, a treasure hunt is simple. Bring in a capitalist and Cuba stays communist. But for Glen, nothing is simple. He's so caught up in communist paperwork, he barely has time to be a capitalist. Glen's had some bad news too. His captain, Ted Hill, has his family living in Havana, and they're tired of his 3-week-long absences at sea. Now Ted's family has decided to return home, and Ted will probably join them. That will leave Glen missing a crew member and Ruben missing a friend.
Me gustó, me encantó haber hecho esa amistad. Siempre voy a recordar a Ted, a Craig. Me ayudaron mucho y además todo lo que sé en este proyecto se lo debo a ellos dos. Se lo debo mucho, le debo mucho a ellos dos.
Back on the Decibar, the hunt goes on with the rest of the crew. Ruben, Freddie, and of course, Comrade Eddie.
Mira, en el estudio de factibilidad, hay una, en la primera hoja creo una azul.
Even Carlos Alberto is on board, and he seems sure they can find a pot of gold with something in it for all. Ultimately, the glitter of gold is different for everyone. Some dream of striking it rich. Others dream of saving socialism or making their country a better place to live. And some are already living their dream just by chasing adventure.
It'd be easy to sit back in the comfort and safety of your hometown and take life the way it comes, but it'd be awful boring too. This coast is full of wrecks from centuries and centuries of ships have been sailing by here and hitting the reefs. And so they're here. It's a matter of locating them.
Castro's gold is out there somewhere, knows Glen, and only communism, bureaucracy, and the ocean itself stand in his way.
Cosecha la rica piña, el mamey, mango dulce como miel, la guayaba